Hello. Hello. The program is Stan the History Man. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler. Well, today I'd like to talk about America's first real tank. And here it is. We called it the Grant tank. The British called it the Lee, and actually we called it the Lee tank. The British called it the Grant tank. And it had it's our first serious tank. Tanks we had World War I, we turned out a number of lightweight Whippet tanks, as they were called, but they never got I think he never got to France. And then afterwards, on the eve of World War II, around 1939, 1940, we built what's called the M1. It was just looked like it was made in a boiler shop, just kind of cobbled together. So this is the first one that they really, let's design this tank and let's try to have it up to date with other tanks. Of course, the other world powers were way ahead of us, at least Germany was. This tank had a number of failings, I should say. One of them was, and let's get this up here for you, was that the main cannon was not in a turret. It was 75 millimeter cannon, but it was just mounted in the hull. They couldn't figure a way to put it in a rotating turret. They had a small turret at the top, but that was for a lightweight gun. And so that was a problem. You had to move the whole tank to draw a bead on an enemy tank. The other problem was that the early ones were riveted together. We hadn't developed a method yet of welding together heavy metal. Matter of fact, the Russians were in advance of that, welded together, had like blocks of steel and iron. And so those are problems with it, but still, it's all we had. We really turned them out the American way of mass producing and using. It was like locomotive country, like Baldwin Locomotive and company were making these tanks, and we shipped them over to the Russians, for example, who kind of thought, well, compared to the T-34, thank you very much, but that's true. But they needed all the tanks they could get, nonetheless. So they graciously accepted them. But the British used a lot of them. We shipped a lot of them to North Africa in the fighting between Rommel and Montgomery and Patton. And the British were so far behind in tanks that they thought they died and gone to heaven when we sent them these Lee tanks, which they called Grant tanks. For some reason, they changed the name, and because they liked that 75 millimeter gun. And so eventually the American authority, the Pentagon, was able to put a 75 millimeter gun in a turret. And that, of course, basically became the famous Sherman tank. And the Grant then, or the Lee, whatever you want to call it, was then relegated to less, where battlefields were not as armor was not as important on battlefields. For example, in the fighting against Japan, the British had many of them in the Burma campaign because Japanese tanks were really not all that great. So the Grant Lee tank was pretty effective there. And at the end of the war, they'd been phased out even before the end of the war. Now it's interesting. I thought, well, the Grant Lee tank, they must be rare. And I was at Fort Hood, the our First Armored Division there, and they actually had one. And I thought, wow, a Lee Grant tank. And I looked it over and photographed it and all. But I Googled out, there are like 20 or 30 various Lee Grants in various states of repair. Some of them actually, they run, okay? But so I just wanted to talk about, our first tank and how we had to learn pretty much by doing in the crucible of World War II. Well, that's Stan the History Man. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.